On that muggy morning in southern Alabama, the air seemed too heavy for a simple Tuesday. The metallic sound of the Roosevelt Elementary School bell echoed through the hallways like a gunshot, unleashing a torrent of children who, with laughter and screams, flooded the playground under the blazing sun. It was the kind of noise that always seems harmless, the sound of childhood, of the disregard for time, of life at its purest. But there was something off about this otherwise ordinary scene. A boy, isolated amid the joyful hubbub, walked slowly as if his steps were leading him to a place no one else could see. Eli Thompson, just 10 years old, had a look in his eyes that belied his age. As his classmates ran, he watched the ground with a pained attention. The sun's glare reflected off the hot concrete, and the shadows of the children danced around him. But Eli remained oblivious, standing in the center of the court, as if the entire world had disappeared. Then, without saying a word, he slowly knelt. He placed his hands on a crack that cut a crooked line through the concrete, and tilting his head, closed his eyes as if trying to hear a whisper coming from beneath the earth. Gradually, the collective laughter faded. The sound of bouncing balls stopped. Even the wind seemed to stop. The nearest teacher, confused, approached and asked if he was okay, but the boy didn't answer. When he opened his eyes, his voice sounded calm, but charged with a strange certainty. "She's still. You hear?" The woman hesitated, her heart racing, and before she could ask who she was, Eli added, "She doesn't want to be alone." The silence that followed was so profound that no one dared to breathe. What the teachers didn't know was that at that moment, something dormant beneath that school had just awakened. If this story has already left you with a lump in your throat and curiosity in your chest, subscribe now and leave your like. Because what comes next will prove to you that not all silence from the past is truly dead. A Roosevelt Elementary School, it was located on the outskirts of a small Alabama town, a place where time seemed to move slowly and where old memories had a habit of hiding beneath layers of routine. Built in the 1950s, the school retained the same creaky wooden floors, yellowed walls, and the smell of chalk mixed with damp. It was a dark brick building surrounded by ancient oak trees, and from a distance it seemed peaceful. But those who knew the place well knew there was something uneasy about its stillness. Stories of strange things had always circulated among the town's elders, but they were swallowed up by oblivion, like everything the community preferred not to discuss. The director, Mrs. Clark, a strict woman proud of her impeccable reputation, believed that maintaining discipline was the only way to protect the school's image. For her, children should be molded, not understood. The janitor, however, Mr. Harris, an elderly and superstitious man, avoided passing near the court when the sun set. He would say in a low voice that place had an echo that wasn't new. His words, however, were always met with laughter or disapproving looks. The fear of the simple has never been taken seriously by those who believe they have mastered reason. The only exception was the teacher Sarah Miller, a newcomer with a restless soul and a sensitive gaze. She had been watching Eli since day one and sensed something different about the boy. It wasn't rebelliousness nor absent-mindedness. It was as if he carried the weight of something that didn't belong to him. When he knelt on the court, Sarah was the only one who sensed it wasn't just childish eccentricity. There was something spiritual in that gesture, something that escaped logic and authority. In the following days, the principal ordered no one to mention the incident, fearing that parents would start speculating. "It was just an impressionable child," she would say impatiently. But Sarah couldn't shake Eli's gaze from her mind, that gaze that seemed to span time. As she graded papers at night, the memory of the kneeling boy haunted her. She even heard for a moment the creaking of concrete in her head, as if something begged to be remembered. And it was in this silence, between the disbelief of the adults and the uneasiness of a single teacher, that something began to move again, something that had been waiting to be discovered for decades. And when the signs started to appear again, no one could pretend that it was just a child's imagination. Over the next few days, Roosevelt Elementary's routine seemed to have returned to normal. But there was something different in the air, a silent tension that lingered in the hallways and the restless gazes of the students. Eli, who had previously sat in the back of the classroom and rarely spoke, began acting even more strangely. He didn't run, didn't play, didn't participate in conversations. He spent recess alone, pacing the quad as if searching for a precise point, an invisible boundary between the present and the past. Sometimes he would stop suddenly and remain still, staring at the ground with a furrowed brow, as if trying to decipher a whisper coming from within the earth. Sarah began to notice the details, the way he held his pencil, the way he stared into space during class, his habit of always drawing the same shapes, imperfect circles and a line through the middle, like a crossed-out cross. His classmates teased him, calling him weird, but there was something about the drawings that bothered even those who laughed. It was as if they conveyed an old pain, a silent cry for help. When Sarah asked what they meant, Eli simply replied in a low, trembling voice, "It's where she's sleeping." At home, Eli's mother also began to notice changes. The boy talked in his sleep, mumbling disjointed phrases. "Don't cover it. She's crying again. The door is closed." Sometimes he woke in a cold sweat, and with tears in his eyes, unable to explain what he had dreamed. His mother, a simple and religious woman, took her son to church, believing it was some kind of spiritual disturbance. The pastor prayed, placed his hand on his head, and told him it was just his imagination. But Eli left even more dejected, as if the words had weighed more heavily than they had soothed him. At school, Sarah noticed that the boy's behavior was beginning to spread. Other children reported hearing noises as they passed by the playground, the sound of something scraping on the concrete, a distant cry, or simply a sudden chill. The principal, irritated, ordered the area sealed off and banned the students from playing there. But the next day, Eli drew the same crossed-out cross on the board as always, and when Sarah asked him why, he replied with tears in his eyes, "There's no point in hiding what wants to be found." Those words echoed in the teacher's mind as she felt the mystery grow more vivid, more insistent and closer every day. Something was trying to reveal itself, and Eli was merely the messenger of a story the world had decided to bury. And when the first physical signs began to appear at school, even the doubters were forced to face what was about to awaken. The first concrete sign that something was out of the ordinary came one cloudy morning when a group of students rushed into the principal's office, claiming that the gym floor was breathing. Mrs. Clark, irritated by the childish exaggeration, went to check it out, accompanied by Mr. Harris and teacher Sarah. Upon arriving, they saw that the air above the concrete seemed to shimmer slightly, as if heat were rising from an underground furnace. A metallic smell, a mixture of rust and wet earth, permeated the room. Mr. Harris discreetly made the sign of the cross, but the principal, trying to remain reasonable, ordered everyone back to their classrooms. Even so, before leaving, Sarah noticed something new. The crack had expanded. It now formed a crooked pattern, resembling the outline of a small body. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She replayed in her mind every detail of Eli's gaze, every sentence he'd said, and especially the way the boy seemed to carry a truth the adult world refused to see. Meanwhile, at school, the janitor was making his nightly rounds and heard something that made him stop. The echo of a ball bouncing 3 times, followed by a soft, childlike whisper calling his name. When she looked at the empty court, She swore she saw a shadow moving beneath the dim light of the streetlights. The next day, the teachers began noticing small changes. Objects appearing out of place, doors opening by themselves, lights flickering unexplainedly. The smell of rust now seemed constant, and some students reported feeling a cold coming from the ground. Eli, on the other hand, remained silent, but his eyes betrayed a profound weariness, as if he spent his nights awake in silence with something only he could hear. Sarah, struck by intuition, decided to return to the gym after class. The school was already empty, the sun was beginning to set, and the wind was making branches scrape against the windows. As she approached the crack, she heard a faint crack coming from deep within the earth, as if something were breaking. She knelt, running her hand over the cold concrete, and swore she felt a faint, rhythmic pulse, as if the ground were alive. She recoiled, her heart racing. Turning, she saw Eli standing in the doorway, watching her silently, as if he already knew what she had felt. He just said, "It's starting over." The tone of his voice wasn't that of a child, but of someone who had seen this before. Sarah felt her body go cold. She knew something very old was about to emerge, something that had been sleeping beneath the ground for decades, waiting for the right moment to be heard. And when they tried to understand what was really there, they realized too late that some truths cannot be discovered without a price. The next morning, the principal called a meeting with the teachers and the janitor. The playground incident was beginning to spread among the students, and some parents had already called, demanding explanations for the rumors. Trying to maintain control of the situation, Mrs. Clark ordered a simple inspection. She wanted to put an end to the matter before the story escalated. So she called Mr. Harris to perform a superficial excavation of the site, just to prove that nothing was amiss. Under the blazing sun, the old caretaker began his work. Shovels banged on the broken concrete, the dry sound mingling with the curious murmur of children watching from afar through the windows. Sarah, restless, stood beside him, watching every movement. The ground was harder than expected, as if resisting. After a few hours, Harris gave up, sweating and irritated. "Nothing but dry earth and rocks," he said, trying to mask his discomfort. But when he looked at Eli, standing at the edge of the court, he felt a shiver run down his spine. The boy wouldn't take his eyes off the hole. His eyes seemed to know more than any digging could reveal. Mrs. Clark, satisfied, had the space recovered and the floor painted. "Matter closed," she decreed, with the coldness of someone trying to control fear through authority. That night, Sarah stayed at school, grading papers, and heard distant noises. They were dull, spaced knocks coming from the direction of the gym. She got up slowly, crossed the empty hallway, and upon opening the glass door, froze. The hole they had filled in was intact, as if it had never been disturbed. The floor seemed to have reformed itself, and in the center, a thin crack formed a new pattern, this time resembling a small, open hand. Sarah backed away, terrified, feeling something watching her every step. Turning, she saw Eli's reflection in the glass of the door, standing in the darkness, his eyes shining in the dim light. Of the hallway, he said nothing, just raised a finger to his lips, signaling silence. The next morning, when Sarah went to report what had happened, the principal completely ignored her. "Stories like that just scare children," she said dismissively. But deep inside Sarah, the feeling that the past no longer wanted to be forgotten became impossible to deny. And when the first indisputable sign finally appeared, not even the skeptics could continue to pretend that nothing was happening. That Tuesday morning, the sky dawned shrouded in heavy clouds, and the air seemed denser than usual, as if the entire city were about to hold its breath. Inside the classroom, the sound of children's voices mingled with the rustling of the wind against the windows, creating a strangely tense atmosphere. Sarah was trying to keep the class focused, but she sensed something was about to happen. Eli had been restless since early morning. He sat rigid at his desk, his eyes fixed on the window, his pencil poised between his fingers, as if listening to something only he could hear. Suddenly, the boy stood up, knocking over his chair with a crash that silenced the entire room. His gaze was distant, empty, as if some force had pulled him out of himself. Before anyone could react, he ran down the hallway and through the doors that led to the courtyard. Sarah called to him, shouted his name, but he didn't stop. The sound of his bare footsteps on the concrete echoed like the beating of a racing heart. By the time she reached him, Eli was already kneeling in the center of the court, scraping the ground with his bare hands until his knuckles were raw and blood began to stain the concrete. "Eli, stop it!" she begged, trying to hold him by the shoulders. But the boy, his voice trembling and his eyes watering, whispered between sobs, "She wants to leave." The words, spoken with a mixture of fear and devotion, caused the wind to blow with sudden force, stirring up dust and dry leaves around them. The other children watching through the windows began to cry, some hiding under their desks. The air grew heavy, and a strange sound, something between a moan and a distant cry, echoed beneath the ground. Sarah, overcome with dread, took a few steps back and saw the crack widen beneath the boy's knees, as if the ground answered her call. The principal came running, shouting for everyone to move away, but it was too late. Eli stopped digging, breathing heavily, and lifted his face to the darkening sky. For a moment, time seemed suspended, the sound of the rain beginning to fall, the distant thunder. The boy's gaze, now no longer the same. He whispered something no one could understand, and then he fainted in Sarah's arms, who held him, trembling, his heart racing. In that instant, what had been just a rumor became undeniable. Something was alive beneath that school, and with every breath, every tear, it awakened a little more. And when the investigation began in earnest, the entire city would discover that the past cannot be erased. It just waits for the right moment to resurface. The commotion was immediate. News of Eli's fainting and the strange movement on the court spread throughout the city before the afternoon was even over. Concerned parents crowded the hallways, police were called, and for the first time in decades, Roosevelt Elementary became the center of attention no one could explain. Mrs. Clark, trying to maintain order, insisted it was all just mass hysteria, but Sarah's pale, troubled look contradicted every word. I had seen the ground move. I had felt the pulse of the earth. This was no imagination. A local police expert arrived the next day with simple equipment, simply to reassure the community. As he tapped the excavating iron on the concrete, a strange, hollow sound was heard. He frowned, tested it again, and the same sound repeated, as if the ground concealed a deep cavity. "There must be something underneath," he commented quietly. Sarah watched from afar, arms crossed, heart racing. Beside her, Eli remained silent, his gaze fixed on the crack, as if he knew exactly what was about to be revealed. The police established a perimeter, and the clang of tools echoed across the empty courtyard. The metallic sound of shovels cutting through concrete mingled with the subdued murmur of onlookers crowding the gates. Each knock seemed louder than the last, as if the air itself vibrated with anticipation. Sarah felt her body tremble. With each blow, and without realizing it, she began to pray silently. After hours, the expert stopped. He wiped the sweat from his brow, bent down, and shone his flashlight over the newly dug hole. The reflection of something metallic flickered below. He exchanged a quick glance with one of the agents and in a firm voice ordered, "Keep digging." The sound of the shovels intensified. The damp earth gave off a strong, dense smell, reminiscent of rust and old wood. The hole deepened, and everyone. They knew they weren't just unearthing the past, they were freeing something that had been purposefully forgotten. Eli, who had been motionless until then, stepped forward and whispered, "It's there, right under there." The nearest agent turned in alarm, unsure how a child could know so surely. Sarah held him back, afraid he'd come too close. The wind blew, cold and biting, and the streetlights began to flicker. The digging stopped. The expert looked up and said, almost in a whisper, "There's something here, a box." The crowd fell silent. The sound of the crickets seemed to fade. Sarah looked at Eli and realized he was crying, not from fear but from relief. It was as if, finally, what he carried inside was beginning to find a voice. And when the box was opened, what came out was not just an object. It was a secret capable of staining the entire history of that city. The sound of the shovels ceased, and for a few seconds, no one moved. The sound of the wind seemed to die down, and the only thing audible was the heavy breathing of the men digging. The expert carefully cleared the earth until a dark, damp wooden surface appeared in the yellow light of the lanterns. It was a small, ancient chest, covered with rusty chains and worn nails. The wood, swollen with age, still exuded a strong smell, a mixture of mold and memory. Sarah approached slowly, her heart beating in time with the beads of sweat running down her face. Eli watched from afar, his lips trembling and his hands clasped, as if whatever lay buried there was calling his name. When the expert pulled the trunk out, the sound of metal scraping against the earth made everyone shudder. The principal, who had been trying to maintain her composure, took a step back. Mr. Harris, pale, made the sign of the cross again. Sarah, overcome with a mixture of fear and fascination, asked what they should do. The expert hesitated, looked at her and said, "If we open it, the past will come out with it." Even so, with a blow of the hammer, he broke the corroded padlock. The trunk opened with a sharp click. Inside was a rag doll dressed in the old-school uniform, a faded blue skirt and a stained white blouse. Beside it were an audio tape, a small crucifix, and a folded note in the shaky handwriting of someone on the verge of despair. Sarah took the paper with trembling hands. The words, almost faded, read, "Forgive me. I just wanted her to stop crying." A shiver ran through everyone around. The silence weighed. Like a confession, Eli stepped forward and, undisturbed, knelt before the chest. He gently touched the doll, and in that instant, a chilly wind swept across the courtyard, sending the leaves dancing in swirls around him. The expert's flashlight flickered and went out. For a brief moment, everyone swore they heard a girl's faint laughter coming from somewhere below ground, a sound both sweet and tragic. Sarah bent down, trying to call out to the boy, but when she touched him, she realized he was pale, motionless, his eyes closed. Eli had passed out. Panic gripped those present and confusion spread. As they tried to revive him, Sarah still clutched the note in her hands, unable to comprehend the weight of those words. Later, when they took the boy to the hospital, she returned to the school alone and stood before the gaping hole. The wind had died down, but the air still pulsed, charged with something invisible. Sarah looked around the crack and whispered to herself, "What else is buried here?" She didn't know it, but that chest was just the key. What was about to be revealed wasn't just an ancient secret, but an open wound, one that time, no matter how cruel, could never heal. And when the truth behind the doll and the note came to light, the whole town would discover the kind of silence that screams inside. The hours following the chest's discovery plunged the small town of Fairhope into a state of collective unease. The local newspaper published a timid, unspecified note, but as soon as the word bones appeared in the rumors, people began to surround the gates of Roosevelt Elementary, curious, fearful, and at the same time fascinated by what had finally come to light. Inside the school, The atmosphere was one of confusion and fear. Principal Mrs. Clark locked herself in her office, forbidding any teacher from giving interviews. Sarah, unable to accept it, went to the police station to demand that the tape's contents be analyzed. The next day, a team took the material to the state laboratory. While they waited for the results, Sarah visited Eli in the hospital. The boy remained unconscious, with a serene expression, as if sleeping next to someone only he could see. The weary mother explained that her son was calling a girl's name in his sleep, Lydia. The teacher felt her body freeze. That name echoed within her like something ancient, forgotten, buried along with time. When the tape finally played, everyone in the room heard for the first time the sound of the past. A female voice, breathless and shaky, apologized. Then another voice, cooler, firmer, said, "She wouldn't stop crying. I told her to seal it. No one needs to know." The silence that followed was more frightening than any noise. Sarah covered her mouth with her hands, her heart racing. The officer stopped the recording and revealed what the records confirmed. The recording was dated 1962 and belonged to the school's former principal, who died years later under mysterious circumstances. In the public archives, they discovered that a girl named Lydia Johnson, the daughter of black workers, had disappeared that same year. The case had been closed without investigation. "Run away from home," the cold, bureaucratic document said. No search, no news, just the convenient silence of a time when certain lives were worth less than the reputation of the city's whites. Sarah, reading those lines, felt tears fall heavily. It was as if each word weighed twice as much for the amount of injustice it carried. Meanwhile, something strange was happening at the school. The lights in the gymnasium began to flicker on their own during the night. Residents in nearby houses claimed to hear the sound of a child laughing, followed by hurried footsteps. Mr. Harris, the janitor, swore he saw a small figure cross the playground through the fog. He said it was wearing a blue dress, the same as the dolls. The next morning, Sarah was called back to school. The principal was waiting. For her, pale, holding an old envelope she'd found in a locked basement closet. Inside were black and white photographs. The class of 1962, smiling children, and right in the center, a girl with braids and a sweet gaze. Lydia. In the background, the same courtyard, the same crack that now tore through the modern concrete. It was the same place. Sarah finally understood what Eli was trying to convey. That child's pain had lingered for decades, refusing to fade. He didn't see it. He felt it. Lydia had never left that school, and now, through the boy, she asked for what had been denied her: rest, recognition, justice. The teacher's face hardened. She knew that from that moment on, no one could bury what had been discovered. The past, after all, had found a voice, and it was just beginning to speak. And when the city tried to silence this truth once again, something began to respond from the other side, something that would not accept oblivion as its fate. The revelation shook Fairhope like a silent earthquake. The town, accustomed to hiding its ghosts under carpets of politeness and Sunday masses, now saw its past unearthed in the light of day. The former principal, mentioned in the recording, had been dead for over 20 years, but her family still lived there, influential people owning half the properties in the neighborhood. When the investigation threatened to target their family name, the reaction was immediate. Lawyers, politicians, and even pastors began to intervene, trying to hush up the case in the name of community peace. Peace, a fancy word used to cover up fear. Sarah, outraged, refused to remain silent. She gave interviews, showed documents, and read excerpts from the tape in public. She was called a liar, hysterical, and accused of using an old tragedy for attention. Under pressure from her superiors, Principal Mrs. Clark suspended her for emotional instability, claiming her behavior was damaging the school's image. But no one could ignore what was already before their eyes. The records, the photos, the recording, and above all, the name Lydia Johnson, now echoing through the streets like an ineradicable memory. As newspapers debated whether or not there was enough evidence, the school began to empty. Parents pulled their children out saying the place was cursed. Mr. Harris resigned after finding small, dirt-stained handprints on the doors in the cleaning closet. She said she heard a faint, distant chuckle coming from the gym and swore. She felt a cold breeze pass by him, whispering, "Thank you." Eli, still frail, was discharged. He returned to school just once, accompanied by his mother and Sarah, just to see the place where it all began. The playground was boarded up, surrounded by yellow tape. Even so, the boy walked to the edge, crouched down, and pressed his ear to the ground, silent. After a few seconds, he stood up and said simply, "Now she knows she's not forgotten." The next day, the city announced the permanent closure of Roosevelt Elementary. The official justification, structural problems. But those who lived nearby knew the problem wasn't the building, it was the people sleeping underneath it. Sarah took one last look at the facade before the gates were locked. The windows reflected the evening light, and for a moment she swore she saw the figure of a girl standing in the middle of the courtyard, silently watching. He blinked, and the image vanished. But the wind that blew soon after seemed to carry a familiar whisper, soft, persistent, almost human. And it was at that moment, when everyone believed that the story had ended, that the boy returned to the court and showed that the silence had never really ceased. Time passed slowly after the closure of Roosevelt Elementary. The weeks dragged on, and the topic, once a feverish topic in headlines and street conversations, was slowly pushed into oblivion, like everything the town preferred not to feel. But for Sarah, the silence was just another reminder that what happened there would never be erased. And on a cold Sunday morning just before sunrise, she received an unexpected call, or had been seen at the old school. The teacher's heart raced. She got into her car without thinking and drove through the still empty streets to the rusted gate. The building, now abandoned, was covered in leaves and dust, and the wind made the windows rattle with a hollow sound, as if someone were still walking the halls. Sarah entered, the echo of her own footsteps guiding her. In the courtyard, the cracked concrete waited, and there in the center, kneeling on the very spot where it all began, was Eli. He wore the same white shirt from the day he fainted, now worn and yellowed. His face was serene, his eyes tearful. Before him, drawn in white chalk, was something different. Two figures holding hands, one larger, the other smaller, beneath the soft outline of a cross. Sarah stopped a few feet away, feeling her throat tighten. The boy slowly turned his face and smiled, a calm, peaceful, almost adult smile. "She rested," he said, in a tone that sounded more like a prayer. A light wind blew through the courtyard, stirring the leaves and scattering the chalk dust. The sun broke through the clouds and for a brief moment illuminated the drawing on the ground. The white lines shone as if made of living light. Sarah felt her eyes fill with tears. There was no longer any fear, no pain, only the certainty that spiritual justice, however belated, had finally found its way. She reached out to hug the boy, but when she touched him, she realized he was looking past her, as if watching someone invisible. A shiver ran down her spine. She turned instinctively and swore she saw, in the dim light, the silhouette of a girl with braids swinging, standing at the edge of the court. And as the wind carried away the last chalk line, the narrator would understand what that silence meant. Not an end, but a living memory, etched forever. In the land that dared to hide the truth, The sun began to sink behind the ancient trees of Roosevelt Elementary, and the courtyard, once filled with voices, laughter, and whispered secrets, was plunged into a shimmering, almost mystical golden light, as if time itself had decided to slow down to observe what was about to unfold. The wind carried a scent of wet earth and ancient leaves, mingled with the rusty smell of the fence and the aged wood that surrounded the courtyard. Sarah stood there, motionless, watching Eli in reverent silence, feeling an unfamiliar weight slowly dissipate. For a moment she felt as if she were not just looking at a student, but at something much older, something that understood what adults had forgotten, the power of silence, memory, and innocence. Eli was still kneeling in the center of the court, his eyes fixed on the ground as if listening to something only he could hear. The air around him seemed to vibrate, thick, as if the atmosphere itself were, breathing along with the boy. No birds sang, no noise came from the street. Even the rustling of the trees had ceased, as if all of nature was observing the moment with respect. When he finally stood, he did so slowly, holding in his small hands the rag doll that had been found buried beneath the crack in the concrete. Now, however, the toy looked different. The dirt was gone, the strands of woolen hair were clean, and the stitched face seemed almost to smile. Eli walked toward Sarah with firm, calm steps, his gaze serene, without a trace of fear. He held out the doll and placed it in the teacher's hands. His voice, though soft, carried a certainty no 10-year-old should possess. "She's not alone anymore." The words echoed softly, yet so deeply they seemed to cross the space between worlds. At that very moment, a breeze blew across the court, and the yellow tape cordoning off the area, placed there years ago to keep everyone away from the place where the tragedy had occurred, delicately loosened, fluttering in the air like veils being removed from a forgotten altar. Sarah watched, stunned, as the wind swirled gently, and for a brief moment she thought she heard laughter, childish laughter, distant, almost ethereal. As if coming from somewhere beyond time, a shiver ran down her spine, not of fear, but of something deeper, a mixture of peace and gratitude. It was as if the courtyard itself, silent witness to so many secrets, could finally breathe a sigh of relief. She looked up and saw the sky tinged with orange and violet, and in that instant she understood that what Eli had done was not just an innocent gesture, but an act of liberation. Lydia's presence, the missing girl, the voice that had echoed for so long in nightmares and rumors, had somehow found a way to say goodbye. There was no pain, only calm. The past, so often buried by denial and fear, had finally been heard. And in that very moment, Sarah understood that the silence of the school was no longer a void. It was a space filled with memories that had finally found rest. She looked around and noticed how the evening light seemed to reshape the courtyard, revealing details that had previously gone unnoticed. The cracks in the concrete now formed a line that resembled the outline of two clasped hands. And as the sun set, the shadows cast by Eli's body and the nearby trees seemed to dance gently across the ground, creating for a moment the image of two children walking side by side, one flesh and blood, the other made of memory. Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she would never set foot in that place again, but she also understood that part of her had remained there, hidden between the roots of the ancient trees and the cold concrete of the courtyard. The sound of the wind now seemed like a prayer, a farewell. And as Eli walked beside her toward the gate, clutching the rag doll tightly to his chest, the last beam of sunlight penetrated the fence and illuminated for a brief second the center of the courtyard, the very spot where it all began. The teacher turned around one last time. The courtyard was silent but not empty. Her heart felt light, as if an invisible presence were watching her tenderly. It was the end of one story, but also the beginning of another. A story that perhaps no one would ever dare tell, but that would live on in every whisper of the wind, in every echo of laughter that time kept within the school walls. And so the final narration emerges as a prayer, slow, grave, and charged with meaning. When a child feels what adults have chosen to forget, the past comes back to be heard. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay up to date with future stories. Each story holds an echo of the invisible, and perhaps the next mystery is closer than you think.